everyone, I'm Kay. Welcome to ArtBookNook, where I share my fantastic collection of art and craft books. If you're just beginning your watercolour journey, one of the most helpful things you can find is a book that teaches the basics without making the process feel rigid or intimidating. Wild Watercolour by Inga Buividavice introduces the beginner basics of watercolour through playful paintings of wildlife and nature. So let's take a look inside. We can see from the contents page the book is broken up into three main sections. So we start with watercolour basics, and then there are 15 lovely projects for you to try your hand at, concluding with final thoughts and further reading and resources. In the introduction, Inga explains that painting animals in watercolour can be challenging, as it requires careful observation and a good understanding of the medium. To make the process more manageable, the book breaks things down into small steps. Through a series of exercises and projects, the aim of the book is to build your confidence while developing both technical skills and creative expression. Inga describes watercolour as a wonderfully unpredictable medium, where even experienced artists are sometimes surprised by the outcome. She then highlights three key areas to focus on when developing your painting. The first is understanding light and shadow, which forms the foundation of any successful composition. Second is learning to control the paint to water ratio, gradually developing a feel for how much water to use. And finally, colour, which helps to establish the mood of a painting, and to remind you that watercolour often dries lighter than it appears when first applied to watercolour paper. Inga encourages you to embrace what she calls perfect imperfection. Rather than striving for absolute control, she suggests that the small accidents and unexpected marks that occur in watercolour often give a painting its character. By painting regularly and keeping a sketchbook, it becomes possible to see how your skills gradually develop over time. Here Inga talks about getting started with watercolour. She explains that she began with very modest supplies, just a small paint set, a few brushes and some affordable paper. And her advice for beginners is the same. Keep things simple, but do try to avoid the very cheapest paper, as good paper can make a real difference when painting with watercolour. In the materials section, Inga explains that student grade paper tends to dry quickly and can produce dull or muddy washes, whereas artist grade paper allows colours and gradients to remain clean and subtle. For the best results, Inga recommends working on 300 gram, which is 140 pounds, 100% cotton paper. She personally prefers cold press paper, which has a gentle texture which works well when painting animals. Inga explains the different options available when working with watercolour paints, which come in both pans and tubes, and mentions gouache, another water-based paint that can be diluted like watercolour but becomes opaque when used more thickly. Watercolour pencils can be used either dry or activated with water to add detail, strengthen colour or create shadows. Inga explains how the shape of a brush will create different types of brush strokes. A mop brush is her most frequently used tool, as it can hold a large amount of paint and produce both broad strokes and fine lines depending on how much pressure you apply. She also uses round brushes for softer edges and small areas, along with detail, flat and dagger brushes for specific effects such as fine lines, structured edges or background foliage. Before you move on to the painting exercises, Inga mentions a few additional materials that can be useful when working with watercolour, such as palettes, masking fluid, paper towels and a spray bottle for controlling moisture and pigment. So we'll now take a look at the main techniques Inga explores throughout her lovely book. We begin with wet on wet, which involves applying paint to damp paper, allowing colours to flow and blend softly together, creating loose atmospheric effects. Wet on dry offers more control, producing sharper edges that are useful when defining shapes and adding details. Glazing builds depth by layering transparent washes once the previous layer has dried. If you're interested in exploring glazing in more detail, I also have a separate video on the channel demonstrating that particular technique. I'll link to it for you in the description below. And finally, we have lifting or softening techniques, which allow paint to be removed or lightened to create highlights and softer transitions. Splashes and splatters should be used intentionally to introduce energy, texture and movement into a painting. Different effects can be achieved depending on the brush size, the amount of water in the paint and how the brush is tapped or flicked. Larger splashes are created with a heavily loaded brush, while fine splatters can be made using a smaller brush or even a toothbrush to scatter tiny droplets across the paper. Inga shares that while she was learning, she encountered both structured academic drawing and a more intuitive approach, and believes that each has its place. In her own work, Inga prefers to keep preliminary sketches simple, using just enough structure to establish the proportions of the subject. She also introduces a few helpful observational techniques, including measuring proportions with a pencil, checking vertical and horizontal alignments, and using negative space to better understand complex shapes. Curved forms can be built using short angled strokes rather than smooth continuous lines, which often will improve your accuracy and the structure. Inga also suggests working from multiple references, focusing first on the overall shape of the subject before worrying about details, and use a light touch with the pencil, along with regular sketching practice to strengthen observation and your hand-eye coordination. To avoid damaging your watercolour paper as a consequence of excessive erasing, Inga suggests that you make your sketch on a separate sheet of paper and then trace it onto the final surface. On the right-hand page, Inga briefly introduces colour mixing, explaining how the three primary colours of red, yellow and blue can all be combined to create a wide range of secondary hues. Inga recommends starting with the lightest colour when mixing paint, gradually adding the darker pigment to adjust the tone. And here we have a simple overview of the colour wheel, showcasing primary, secondary and tertiary colours. Complementary colours are those positioned opposite each other on the colour wheel, which can be mixed together to create more muted natural tones. And Inga demonstrates a couple of ways of mixing colours, either on the palette or directly on the paper, using a wet-on-wet technique or layering transparent washes to build richer colour variations. A painting doesn't need to match the exact colours of the reference, provided the tonal values are correct. Adding more water creates lighter tones, while thicker paint produces darker, richer values. These tonal variations can also be developed by layering colour using glazing techniques. A useful tip is suggested here, and that's to view reference images in black and white, or simply squint at the subject, which can make it easier to recognise the underlying structure of light and shadow in your painting. I've noticed that Inga's technique and colour explanations are quite concise and visual. She focuses more on you learning through her practical painting projects rather than giving you lengthy theory sections. With that in mind, let's move on to the project section. Inga says the best way to learn watercolour is simply through painting and experimentation. So these projects will explore different watercolour techniques while you paint a variety of animals, allowing you to practice textures such as fur, skin and shell. The aim is not for you to follow a rigid formula, but for you to experiment and discover which approaches work best for you. Before you begin any of the projects, Inga offers a few practical notes. She encourages you not to feel restricted by the exact colours she has listed in the book, but to use whatever paints that you already have and experiment with your own combinations. Each project includes a suggested colour palette which can help guide your choices, although the emphasis is on exploration rather than sticking to strict rules. Before painting, you'll first prepare a simple pencil sketch and transfer it onto watercolour paper, ready to begin your project. This first project will teach you one of the most fundamental watercolour techniques, glazing. This involves building depth by applying transparent layers of colour, allowing each layer to dry before adding the next. It's a simple but very effective way to create depth, richness and form in a painting. If you've seen my glazing video here on my channel, you'll recognise this approach. The project is broken down into a series of clear stages, beginning with a loose wash to establish the basic colour and shape of the ladybird. As the layers build, additional colour is glazed over the surface, gradually deepening the red of the shell and introducing darker tones for the body and markings. By allowing each layer to dry before adding the next, the painting slowly develops depth and form. The final stage adds the distinctive black spots and small details that will bring the ladybird to life. A few loose paint splashes help create a sense of movement and energy in the composition. On the right-hand page, Inga encourages you to experiment with glazing by layering colours and allowing them to overlap, creating new tones and subtle variations. In this second project, Colourful Beetles, you'll explore another fundamental watercolour technique, that of wet-on-wet painting. The projects all follow a similar structure, each introducing a new technique through clear step-by-step stages with encouragement to experiment further. So rather than describe every project in detail, which will take quite a while, I'll let you enjoy a look through the remaining projects, accompanied by some relaxing music, and I'll meet you at the end. Inga now shares how keeping sketchbooks has played an important role in her own creative process, helping her experiment freely and develop ideas without the pressure of creating finished work. And she shares examples from her own sketchbooks, demonstrating how quick studies and loose explorations can gradually build confidence and improve observational skills. And if you choose to make your own sketchbook, this will allow you to decide on the format and paper that best suits the way you like to work. Here Inga demonstrates how to begin with simple pencil shapes to position the subjects, gradually refining the drawing before adding colour. Allowing sketches to overlap or remain slightly unfinished creates a sense of movement and spontaneity across the page. And adding line work is another option. The contrast between loose watercolour shapes and more defined lines can also bring energy and clarity to a composition. I really like Inga's sketches of the octopus. The final section of the book looks at style and creativity. Inga begins by exploring the question, what is style? Every artist always wants to try and find their style. She describes style as not a particular skill level, but as a personal aesthetic that you personally bring to your work. The way your choices of colour, marks and subject gradually shape a recognisable voice in your art. It's a bit like handwriting. Inga recommends working from a monochrome reference photo and painting using a limited palette of a single colour. Exercises like this are a fantastic way to understand values, light, midtones and darks, that will give a subject its form and structure. An understanding of values and how to paint them will make a huge difference to your art. I'll add a link in the description below to a video I recorded recently when I reviewed The Art of Notan by the incredible Diane Mize, How to Paint Light and Shadow. Inga's beautiful book concludes with a few final thoughts, reminding us that art is ultimately about imagination, curiosity, and allowing ourselves freedom to experiment. Developing skill and confidence takes time, but by focusing on the joy of the process, rather than fretting too much about the result, our style will naturally begin to emerge. The final pages provide some further reading and resources and acknowledgements. I think Wild Watercolour is a lively and encouraging guide for beginners to learn to paint animals in watercolour. Through a combination of techniques, creative step-by-step projects, Inga invites you to explore the medium in a playful and experimental way. I hope you've enjoyed this review and found it helpful. If you give the video a like, or even better a hype, it really helps it to reach other artists and art book lovers. In the description below, you'll find links to where you can buy your own copy of Inga's lovely book and support the channel at the same time. I've also included links to more information about Inga and her work, along with the other resources I've mentioned in this video. If you've already painted from Inga's book yourself, or have any other favourite titles on painting wildlife in watercolour, I'd love to hear about them in the comments below. It really makes my day, and I do reply to every one. And I'm curious, which animal in the book would you most like to try painting? I quite fancy the cute red panda. Thank you so much for watching, I do appreciate it, and I'll see you again soon here at ArtBookNook.